Sand grated against the windows like crushed glass, a blinding, choking fury that swallowed the Texas plains whole. Abigail Miller sat alone in her isolated farmhouse, a widow holding the final remnants of a life that the frontier was trying desperately to steal. Then, over the howl of the wind, a heavy thud rattled her heavy oak door. It wasn't the wind. It was a man, half dead, bleeding out on her porch, wrapped in the thick furs of the high country. Taking him in was a terrible risk. 2 days later, a dozen armed riders crested the ridge to prove exactly how big of a mistake she'd made. The panhandle of Texas in 1888 was no place for a woman entirely on her own, a fact the townsfolk of Oak Haven loved to remind Abigail Miller every time she rode in for supplies. Her husband Josiah had been in the ground for 14 months, taken by a sudden spring fever that burned him from the inside out. Since then, Abigail had stubbornly clung to their homestead, a sprawling patch of dry earth and stubborn scrub grass that yielded little but heartache. On the afternoon of November 9th, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The horizon disappeared, replaced by a towering wall of brown dirt rushing across the plains. A black blizzard. Abigail had only minutes to secure the shutters, tie the livestock in the barn, and retreat into the sturdy stone and sod house. When the storm hit, it sounded like a freight train was driving straight through her living room. Fine silt pushed through the microscopic cracks in the masonry, coating the floorboards, the dining table, and her weary hands in a layer of grit. She was huddled by the cast-iron stove, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, when she heard the sound. It was a dull, rhythmic thumping, barely audible over the roaring wind. Abigail froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She glanced at the mantel where Josiah's double-barreled shotgun rested. No neighbor would be out in this. No stray cattle could knock. She grabbed the weapon, her knuckles white, and moved toward the door. "Who's there?" she shouted, though her voice was swallowed instantly by the tempest outside. The thumping came again, weaker this time, followed by a heavy scrape against the wood. Abigail unlatched the heavy iron bolt and cracked the door open. The wind immediately ripped it from her grasp, slamming it against the interior wall with a violent crash. A maelstrom of dust blinded her, but she felt the heavy weight of a body collapsing over her threshold. Coughing and squinting, she dragged the heavy mass inside, fighting with every ounce of her strength to push the door shut and throw the bolt against the screaming wind. When she finally cleared her eyes, she gasped. Lying on her braided rug was a man, but he looked like he had fallen out of a different world. He was a giant of a man, clad not in the denim and cotton of a plains rancher, but in heavily weather-beaten buckskin and a thick, blood-stained wolf fur coat. He wore high leather moccasins wrapped to the knee, and a wide-brimmed felt hat lay crushed beneath his broad shoulders. He smelled of pine needles, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Abigail knelt beside him, keeping the shotgun within arm's reach. She rolled him onto his back. He was unconscious, his rugged face pale beneath a heavy, dark beard and a thick layer of prairie dirt. His breathing was shallow and ragged. "Mister?" she coaxed, tapping his cheek. He didn't stir. It was then she noticed the dark pool spreading across her rug from his right side. Carefully, she pulled back the heavy fur coat. A dark crimson stain saturated his buckskin shirt, a gunshot wound. It was a clean through-and-through graze along his lower ribs, but he had lost a terrifying amount of blood. Her isolation had taught her a harsh pragmatism. If she left him there, he would die. If she helped him, she might be inviting the devil into her home. She looked at his weathered face, the deep lines etched by the sun and harsh winters of the high country. He didn't look like a local outlaw. He looked like a man who belonged to the mountains, entirely out of place in this flat, desolate ocean of dust. Abigail went to work. She boiled water on the stove, tore strips of clean linen from an old bedsheet, and retrieved a bottle of harsh rye whiskey Josiah had kept for medicinal purposes. Kneeling beside the stranger, she unlaced his heavy shirt, exposing a chest scarred by old battles with nature. She cleaned the wound, wincing in sympathy as she poured a generous splash of the alcohol over the torn flesh. The man jolted, a harsh, guttural groan tearing from his throat. His eyes flew open, piercing, icy blue eyes that immediately locked onto her. His massive hand shot out, gripping her wrist with bruising force. "Easy," Abigail commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You're shot. I'm cleaning it. Let go of my arm." The mountain man stared at her, his chest heaving. The wild panic in his eyes slowly gave way to hazy comprehension. He looked around the modest, firelit room, then back to the woman holding the bloodied rag. Slowly, his grip loosened, and his hand fell heavily to the floor. They're coming," he rasped, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "Who?" Abigail asked, applying pressure to the wound with a fresh bandage. "Hayes," the man choked out, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Jasper, Hayes." Before Abigail could ask anything more, the man's eyes slid shut, and he plunged back into unconsciousness. Abigail sat back on her heels, the name sending a cold shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty house. Jasper Hayes. Everyone in the territory knew that name. He was a ruthless enforcer, a hired gun who did the bloody, unspeakable work for the wealthy cattle syndicates up north. If Jasper Hayes was looking for this mountain man, Abigail had just painted a massive target on her own front door. For the rest of the night, while the storm raged and battered the little homestead, Abigail kept a vigil. She fed the fire, occasionally pressing a cool, wet cloth to the stranger's feverish brow. She took inventory of his belongings. He carried a heavy hunting knife, a Colt revolver with a filed-down sight, and a battered leather satchel tightly secured across his chest. She didn't open the satchel. It felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross, but she couldn't stop staring at it. As dawn approached, the howling wind finally began to die down, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence in its wake. Abigail sat in Josiah's rocking chair, the shotgun resting heavy across her lap, watching the stranger breathe, waiting for the dust to settle, and wondering what kind of storm she had just let into her house. The morning light broke through the grimy windows, casting long, dusty shafts across the wooden floorboards. The black blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape completely transformed. Outside, dunes of red dirt were piled high against the fences, and the sky was a fragile, cloudless blue. Inside, the mountain man finally stirred. Abigail was at the stove, frying a few strips of cured bacon and brewing chicory coffee. The smell seemed to pull the man from the depths of his fever. He groaned, shifting his massive frame, and immediately hissed in pain as his injured side protested. "I wouldn't move too fast if I were you," Abigail said without turning around. She expertly flipped the bacon with a long iron fork. "You lost enough blood to kill a lesser man." The stranger pushed himself up into a sitting position, leaning heavily against the base of her sofa. He looked down at his torso, noting the tight, clean bandages. He then looked up at Abigail, studying her with a sharp, calculating gaze. She was tall, with pragmatic dark hair tied back in a messy braid, wearing a faded calico dress stained with soot and his blood. "You stitched me up," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, rumbling from his chest. "I bound it. The bullet passed through." "You're lucky it didn't shatter a rib," she replied, bringing a tin cup of steaming coffee and a plate of bacon to a small stool near him. She set it down and stepped back, maintaining her distance. "Eat, drink. Then you can tell me why a man who smells like a pine forest is bleeding out in the middle of the Texas flats." He picked up the coffee cup, his large, calloused hands dwarfing the tin. He took a long sip, closing his eyes briefly in appreciation. "Name's Levi. Levi Calhoun." "Abigail Miller." Levi's eyes snapped open. He lowered the cup, staring at her with sudden, intense focus. "Miller? You said Miller?" "I did," Abigail said, crossing her arms. She didn't like the sudden shift in his demeanor. It felt electric, dangerous. "My late husband was Josiah Miller. This is his homestead." Levi let out a long, slow breath, running a hand over his bearded face. He looked at the ceiling, letting out a dark, humorless chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. The Almighty has a wicked sense of humor." "Care to explain that, Mr. Calhoun?" Abigail asked, her tone hardening. Levi slowly reached for the leather satchel, still slung across his chest. He unbuckled the worn flap and reached inside, pulling out a heavy, folded parchment sealed in waterproof oilcloth. He held it out to her. "I didn't come to Texas by accident, Mrs. Miller," Levi said, his voice grave. "I've been riding hard for 3 weeks from the Sangre de Cristo range in Colorado. I was looking for Josiah Miller." Abigail's brow furrowed. She stepped forward and took the oilcloth, her fingers brushing against his calloused skin. "Josiah has been dead for over a year. He was a dirt farmer. Why would a mountain man be looking for him?" "Because of his brother," Levi answered. Abigail stopped, unwrapping the cloth. "Arthur?" Josiah hadn't spoken to Arthur in 10 years. Arthur was a dreamer, went west to dig for silver, and never came back. "He found it," Levi said quietly. 2 months ago, Arthur Miller struck a vein of pure silver deep in an unmarked canyon. He hired me to guide him out of the mountains to register the claim. Levi's eyes darkened, the memory clearly bringing a shadow over his face. "We didn't make it. Jasper Hayes and his outfit caught our trail. They knew what Arthur had found. They ambushed us at a river crossing. Arthur caught a bullet in the neck. I barely got out alive. But before he passed, he shoved this into my hands and told me to find his brother in Texas." Abigail stared at the document in her hands. She finally pulled back the oilcloth. It was an official assayer's document and a map bearing a stamp from the Colorado Territory. "That claim is worth millions, Abigail," Levi said softly. "And since Arthur had no wife and Josiah is dead, that paper you're holding makes you one of the wealthiest women west of the Mississippi." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. She dropped the paper onto the small table as if it had caught fire. "I don't want it. I don't care about silver. I care about surviving." "You don't have a choice anymore," Levi said, grimacing as he shifted his weight. "Hayes didn't just want Arthur dead. He needs that deed to legitimize the claim. He tracked me out of the mountains, across the plains. His men caught up to me 2 days ago near the Canadian River. That's where I caught this bullet. I managed to lose them in the canyonlands before the storm hit, but they are ruthless, and they are close." "You brought them here," she whispered, the horrifying reality settling over her. "I tried to lead them away, but the storm blinded me. My horse broke its leg in a prairie dog hole 5 miles back. I walked until I saw your light," Levi confessed, his eyes filled with genuine regret. "I am sorry, Abigail. If I had known Josiah was gone, if I had known you were here alone, I would have burned the map and died in the dirt." Abigail looked at the rugged, bleeding man, then at the map. Her mind raced. The homestead was defensible, but not against a gang of professional killers. They had a shotgun, a revolver, and nowhere to run. "Can you shoot?" she asked, her voice trembling but finding a core of steel she didn't know she possessed. "Better than most," Levi replied. "Good, because you're going to have to prove it." Abigail walked past him to the front door. She unbolted it and pulled it open to survey the damage to the property. The cold, crisp, post-storm air flooded the room. She stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the glare of the morning sun bouncing off the sea of red dust. She looked out toward the eastern ridge, the only elevated point for miles. Her breath caught in her throat. There, silhouetted against the bright morning sky, dust was being kicked up into the air. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic, deliberate churning of horses' hooves. One rider crested the hill, then another, then 3 more. Within seconds, a line of 12 armed men sat atop the ridge, staring down at the isolated farmhouse. At the center of the line sat a man on a massive black thoroughbred, wearing a long duster coat. Even from this distance, Abigail could feel the malice radiating from them. "Levi," Abigail called out, her voice tight, stepping back inside and reaching for the shotgun. "We're out of time." Dust still lingered in the stagnant air as Jasper Hayes spurred his black thoroughbred a few paces forward, separating himself from the line of hired guns. He was a striking man in a terrifying way, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit beneath his duster, sporting a silver-studded gun belt that caught the harsh Texas sun. He looked less like a frontier outlaw and more like a ruthless Eastern Railroad baron, which only made his presence on Abigail's porch more menacing. "Mrs. Abigail Miller!" Hayes's voice boomed across the dry yard, smooth, practiced, and dripping with false civility. I know you have a guest in there. A large, bleeding man who is currently in possession of stolen property belonging to the Denver Consolidated Mining Syndicate. Send him out, hand over the map, and we ride away. You have my word as a gentleman. Abigail pressed her back against the thick, sodden stone wall beside the window, her heart threatening to crack her ribs. She looked at Levi. The mountain man was awkwardly propped against the overturned oak dining table, loading a Winchester rifle he had pulled from his heavy leather satchel. His jaw was set in a rigid line of pain and pure defiance. "He's lying," Levi whispered, sliding a cartridge into the chamber with a sharp metallic clack. "He leaves no witnesses. Ever." That's how he's managed to avoid the hangman's noose in Judge Isaac Parker's courtroom up in Fort Smith all these years. If you open that door, we are both dead before our knees hit the floorboards. Abigail swallowed hard, gripping Josiah's double-barreled shotgun. I know how men like him operate. Banker Thaddeus Bancroft, up in Oakhaven, speaks with that same polite poison right before he forecloses on a starving family. She took a deep breath and shouted through the broken glass of the window pane. "Mr. Hayes, I am a widow living alone." The storm brought nothing but dirt to my doorstep. "You are trespassing on my property." Hayes let out a slow, dramatic sigh, shaking his head. He reached into his coat and pulled out a long, silver-barreled revolver. "That is a profound disappointment, Mrs. Miller. Truly." He didn't yell an order. He merely flicked his wrist. Instantly, the ridge erupted in smoke and thunder. Bullets chewed through the wooden siding of the farmhouse, shattering the remaining windows and sending showers of glass and splinters across the room. Abigail screamed, dropping to the floor and covering her head as a barrage of lead tore her modest home to shreds. Cast iron pans clanged as they were struck. The ceramic pitcher on the washstand exploded into fine white powder. Levi didn't flinch. He rose slightly, resting the barrel of his Winchester on the edge of the window frame. He took a single, calculated breath, squeezed the trigger, and a rider to the left of Hayes tumbled backward off his horse, his foot catching in the stirrup as the panicked animal dragged him down the ridge. "Return fire!" Hayes finally roared, his calm facade shattering. Levi pumped the lever action, firing twice more, dropping a second man before ducking below the barrage. "We can't hold them off for long," he grunted, pressing a hand against his side where fresh crimson was seeping through Abigail's bandages. "They have enough ammunition to flatten this house into the dirt." "There's a root cellar," Abigail yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. "Under the kitchen rug. It connects to an old drainage pipe that empties out near the dry creek bed behind the barn." Levi looked at her, a spark of genuine admiration flashing in his icy blue eyes. Josiah never mentioned his wife was a tactical genius. "Josiah never had 12 men trying to murder him before breakfast," she snapped back. "Can you move?" Before he could answer, a heavy thud landed on the roof, followed by a sickening, unmistakable crackle. Abigail looked up. Orange light began to flicker through the cracks in the wooden ceiling. They were throwing kerosene torches. The dry sod and ancient timber of the roof caught instantly, feeding hungrily on the oxygen. Within seconds, the farmhouse filled with thick, blinding smoke. "Move!" Levi commanded, grabbing her arm with his massive hand and pulling her toward the kitchen. The heat was becoming unbearable, the roar of the flames competing with the continuous gunfire outside. Abigail kicked the braided rug aside and hoisted the heavy iron ring of the cellar door. They scrambled down the wooden stairs into the cool, dark earth just as a massive section of the burning roof collapsed into the living room, sending a plume of sparks raining down onto the floorboards above them. Abigail pulled the heavy trapdoor shut, plunging them into pitch blackness. She coughed violently, her lungs burning from the smoke. In the dark, she felt Levi's large hand find her shoulder, steadying her. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling as the reality of her burning home set in. Everything she had built, everything she had suffered for, was turning to ash above their heads. "Follow the wall," Levi instructed, his breathing ragged. They crawled through the narrow, dirt-packed drainage tunnel. It was suffocatingly tight for a man of Levi's size, and Abigail could hear him gritting his teeth in agony with every movement that pulled at his torn side. After agonizing minutes of dragging themselves through the dark, they felt the cool rush of outside air. They tumbled out into the dry creek bed behind the barn, concealed by the deep banks and the thick mesquite bushes. Above them, the farmhouse was a roaring inferno, sending a massive column of black smoke into the pristine Texas sky. Hayes and his men were circling the blaze, waiting like vultures to shoot anyone who ran out the front door. "My horse, Clementine, is in the barn," Abigail whispered, pointing to the weathered wooden structure 50 yards away. "She's fast. A quarter-mile horse. We can ride double." "Where to?" Levi asked, leaning heavily against the dirt bank. He was pale, sweating profusely. "South," Abigail said, her eyes hardening as she looked at the burning remains of her past. "Into Palo Duro Canyon. It's a maze of red rock and dead ends. I grew up exploring the rim. Hayes might have numbers, but down there the canyon favors the prey." Riding double on a panicked mare while dodging stray bullets was an exercise in pure terror. When Hayes's men finally realized the pair had escaped the inferno, they had already broken from the cover of the barn, sprinting across the flatlands toward the gaping maw of the earth to the south. Bullets kicked up geysers of red dirt around Clementine's hooves, but the mare ran with the spirit of the wind, terrified by the crack of the rifles and the smell of smoke. Abigail gripped the reins, leaning low over the horse's neck, while Levi sat behind her, firing his Winchester backward with one hand to keep the pursuers at bay. The flat prairie suddenly vanished. The earth dropped away in a sheer, breathtaking cliff of rusted red sandstone and green juniper. This was Palo Duro, the Grand Canyon of Texas, a violent gash in the otherwise featureless plains. Abigail didn't hesitate. She guided Clementine down a steep, treacherous goat path that wound along the cliff face. The horse slipped, sending loose rocks tumbling hundreds of feet into the gorge below, but Abigail's steady hands kept them upright. They descended into the shadows of the canyon, the temperature dropping immediately as the towering rock walls swallowed the morning sun. For 2 hours, they rode deep into the labyrinth, twisting through narrow slot canyons, splashing through shallow, muddy creeks, and doubling back through dense thickets of hackberry and cottonwood to mask their trail. Only when they reached a secluded overhang, a massive cavern hollowed out by centuries of flash floods, did Abigail finally pull back on the reins. Levi practically fell off the horse. He collapsed into the fine red dust of the cave floor, clutching his bleeding side. "Levi!" Abigail slid off Clementine and rushed to him. His buckskin shirt was soaked entirely through. The rough ride had torn the wound wide open. "I'm all right," he gasped, though his lips were a pale, sickly gray. "Just need a minute." "You need a doctor, and we are 30 miles from the nearest one," Abigail said, panic edging into her voice. She quickly unsaddled the horse, grabbed her canteens, and rushed back to him. She tore the ruined bandages away. The sight was gruesome. "I've survived worse." Levi managed a weak smile, looking up at her as she frantically cleaned the wound with water. "Grizzly bear up in the Tetons took a chunk out of my shoulder the size of a dinner plate. This is just a scratch." "You're a terrible liar, Mr. Calhoun," Abigail said softly, her hands trembling as she applied pressure. In the quiet of the canyon, stripped of her home and her old life, the space between them felt suddenly intimate, charged with the electric current of shared survival. She looked at his face, the deep lines of a life lived wild, the fierce intelligence in his eyes, the rugged jaw obscured by dark hair. He was a creature of the mountains, completely foreign to her world, yet he was bleeding for her. Levi reached up, his rough fingers gently wrapping around her wrist, stopping her frantic movements. "Arthur used to talk about you," he said quietly, his voice echoing softly against the sandstone walls. Abigail blinked, surprised. "Arthur? But I only met him twice, before he went west. He barely knew me." "He knew enough," Levi said, his eyes locking onto hers. "He sat by the campfire every night for 2 months, talking about his brother's beautiful wife, the woman with the fire in her eyes who refused to back down from the Texas wind. He said Josiah didn't deserve you, said you were wasted on dirt farming. When he handed me that map, he didn't just tell me to find his brother. He told me to protect you." Abigail felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in her chest. The walls of her pragmatic, hardened heart built up over 14 months of lonely widowhood cracked slightly. "And, what did you think when you finally met me?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Levi's thumb brushed the back of her hand. I thought Arthur didn't do you justice, and I thought I'd be a lucky man if I lived long enough to know you better. The moment hung in the cool canyon air, fragile and heavy, but the harsh reality of the frontier rarely allowed for romance without a price. A sharp, unnatural whistle echoed off the canyon walls in the distance. Levi's expression hardened instantly. The tenderness vanished, replaced by the lethal instincts of a hunted animal. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, reaching for his revolver. "What is it?" Abigail asked, her blood running cold. "That wasn't a bird," Levi gritted out. "That was a signal." Abigail crept to the edge of the cave entrance and peered around the sandstone pillar. Her breath hitched. Less than a quarter-mile down the gorge, moving with horrifying silence, were 3 men on foot. They weren't the loud, clumsy, hired guns from the farmhouse. They wore moccasins and dark clothing, moving like shadows through the brush. Leading them was a man holding a leash. At the end of the leash was a massive, scarred bloodhound, its nose pressed firmly into the red dirt, sniffing the fresh droplets of Levi's blood that dotted the trail. "Hayes didn't just bring gunmen," Abigail whispered, stepping back in horror. "He brought Gideon Rollins. The man is a legend. He tracks runaway slaves and escaped convicts for the territorial governor. He's never lost a bounty." Levi grimaced, checking the cylinder of his Colt. 3 bullets left. "Then we don't run," he said, using the cave wall to haul himself to his feet. "We make a stand right here. If they want this map, they're going to have to bleed for it." Clementine nervously shifted her weight in the cool shadows of the cave, her iron shoes scraping against the stone. Outside, the bloodhound's deep, rhythmic baying echoed off the sheer canyon walls, sounding less like an animal and more like a tolling bell. Levi leaned heavily against a boulder near the entrance, his face a pale mask of exhaustion, thumbing the hammer of his Colt. 3 bullets left. Against 3 trained killers and a legendary tracker, it was a death sentence. Abigail gripped the cold, familiar wood of Josiah's shotgun. She looked at the bleeding mountain man who had risked everything to bring her a fortune she never asked for. She looked at the red dirt of Palo Duro, the labyrinth she had spent her lonely youth mapping in her mind. A quiet, terrifying calm settled over her. She was done running. She was done letting ruthless men dictate her survival. "Levi, look at me," Abigail whispered, crouching beside him. Her voice held no panic, only the hard, unyielding edge of the Texas plains. "Gideon Rollins relies on the dog. The dog relies on the scent. But scent travels strange down here. The wind whips through these narrows and creates ghost trails. Abigail, you can't outsmart a bloodhound on foot," Levi rasped, coughing weakly. "I don't have to," she replied, her eyes dark and calculating. "I just have to outsmart the men holding the leash. Charles Goodnight runs his cattle down at the canyon floor near the Prairie Dog Town Fork. To keep his heifers from wandering into these dead-end slots, his cowboys built deadfall traps out of loose shale and deadwood. There's one right above this overhang." Levi frowned, fighting through the haze of pain. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you stay here and keep their attention forward. Make them think you're cornered," she instructed, sliding her fingers over the twin triggers of her shotgun to ensure it was primed. "There's a narrow fissure at the back of this cavern. It's a tight squeeze, but it leads to the rim right above the entrance. When I give the signal, you fire your first shot." Before Levi could protest or pull her back, Abigail spun on her heel and sprinted toward the darkest recesses of the cave. She found the fissure exactly where her memory left it, a jagged crack barely wide enough for a coyote. Slinging the heavy shotgun over her shoulder, she wedged herself into the rock. The sandstone tore at her faded calico dress and scraped her arms, but she pushed upward, driven by adrenaline and a fierce, protective fury she hadn't felt in years. Below, the crunch of boots on gravel announced the arrival of Hayes's men. "Calhoun!" Gideon Rollins' voice barked out, authoritative and entirely devoid of fear. "The hound says you're bleeding out in that hole. Toss out your weapons in the deed, and I'll see to it you hang in Fort Smith instead of bleeding to death in the dirt." Silence stretched from the cave. Abigail reached the top of the fissure, pulling herself out onto the sun-baked shelf directly above the cavern entrance. She lay flat on her stomach, creeping to the edge and peering over. 50 feet below, Gideon Rollins stood, holding the straining bloodhound. Flanking him were two heavily armed thugs, and stepping out from behind a massive boulder, looking immaculate and entirely out of place in his tailored charcoal suit, was Jasper Hayes. "Enough waiting, Mr. Rollins," Hayes sneered, pulling his silver-barreled revolver. "He's trapped. Flush him out." Rollins unclipped the heavy leather leash. "Fetch him up, boy." The bloodhound surged forward, barking viciously as it charged toward the dark maw of the cave. Abigail didn't hesitate. She cupped her hands around her mouth and let out a piercing, high-pitched whistle, the exact signal Levi had recognized earlier. Inside the cave, Levi immediately stepped into the light, his Colt leveled. He fired. The shot echoed like cannon fire in the narrow gorge. The bullet struck the dirt inches from the charging hound's paws, sending the animal scrambling backward in a cloud of dust, yelping in terror. Hayes and his men instantly raised their rifles, aiming right at Levi's chest. "Hey!" Abigail screamed from the heavens. The four men whipped their heads upward, squinting against the harsh sun glaring off the rim. They didn't see the widow. They only saw the massive pile of loose shale, deadwood, and heavy canyon stones resting precariously on the edge of the shelf. Abigail leveled the double-barreled shotgun at the wooden support strut of the cowboy deadfall. She squeezed both triggers. The massive blast ripped through the quiet canyon. The heavy buckshot splintered the dry wood into 1,000 pieces. Without the strut, gravity took immediate, violent control. A deafening roar filled the gorge as 2 tons of jagged red rock, dirt, and petrified wood cascaded off the shelf. "Avalanche!" Rollins roared, diving backward into the brush. The 2 hired guns barely had time to look up before the massive slide buried them under a crushing wave of stone and dust. The impact shook the canyon floor, sending a massive plume of red dirt billowing into the air, completely blinding the gorge. When the dust finally began to settle, the silence was absolute. Abigail scrambled back down the fissure, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She burst back into the cavern, coughing through the lingering dust. Levi was still standing, clutching the cavern wall for support, his gun fixed on the entrance. Through the haze, a single figure emerged, Jasper Hayes. His expensive suit was torn, his face covered in a mask of red dirt, but his silver revolver was raised, pointed dead at Levi's chest. The man had miraculously dodged the main brunt of the slide. "You mountain trash," Hayes hissed, his sophisticated facade entirely gone, replaced by pure, murderous rage. He cocked the hammer. "I'll peel that map off your corpse." He never got the chance. Abigail stepped out from the shadows, smoothly leveling Josiah's smoking shotgun, snapping it open, loading 2 fresh shells from her pocket, and snapping it shut in one fluid motion. "Mr. Hayes," Abigail said, her voice dropping the temperature in the canyon by 10 degrees. Hayes flinched, turning his weapon toward her. But Abigail was already pulling the trigger. The blast caught Hayes squarely in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the dirt. He didn't move again. From the brush near the creek bed, Gideon Rollins slowly stood up. He brushed the dust off his coat, looking at the buried thugs, the dead syndicate boss, and finally up at the widow standing in the cave entrance, shotgun reloaded and aimed at his head. The bloodhound trotted over to Rollins, sitting obediently at his feet. Rollins looked at Hayes's body, then spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Bounty was on the mountain man. Contract was with Hayes. Employer is dead. Contract is void. He tipped his hat to Abigail, a gesture of profound, genuine respect. "Good day to you, ma'am." Rollins turned and walked away into the canyon, melting into the landscape as if he had never been there. Abigail lowered the shotgun, her hands finally beginning to shake. She turned to Levi. The giant of a man slid down the rock wall, a weary, awestruck smile breaking through his beard. "Remind me," Levi breathed out, closing his eyes, "never to make you angry." Abigail dropped the gun and rushed to his side, pulling his heavy arm over her shoulder. "Come on, Mr. Calhoun. I know a doctor down in Silverton." And after that, I believe we have a train to catch to Colorado or Chin. Together, they limped toward the waiting horse, leaving the ashes of the past behind, bound for the high country and a fortune written in silver and blood. Survival in the unforgiving Wild West wasn't just about drawing the fastest gun. It was about the grit to stand your ground when the whole world came crashing down. Abigail Miller proved that a widow's resilience, combined with a mountain man's unyielding loyalty, was a force far more dangerous than any outlaw syndicate. Their journey from a dusty Texas standoff to a multi-million-dollar silver claim in Colorado reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the fires of adversity. If this gritty tale of frontier justice, unexpected love, and unyielding courage kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with your fellow history buffs and Western lovers, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss out on our next thrilling dive into the wild, untamed legends of the frontier. See you on the trail.